Welcome to Gorillapreneur, the Art of Waging Small Business Warfare podcast, teaching Davids how to defeat Goliaths. Now here's your host, Mark Anthony Peterson.
Welcome back to the podcast for entrepreneurs, startups, and business mavericks. If you're not a maverick, you don't have to go home, but you got to get up out of this podcast. In this podcast, we teach entrepreneurs how to defeat the corporate giant. Just like in the story of David and Goliath, David defeated a much taller and stronger Goliath not by fighting the giant in hand-to-hand combat, but by using technology, a slingshot. The slingshot allowed the smaller David to attack from a distance that minimized the advantages that Goliath had over the smaller David. My name is Mark Anthony Peterson. I'm a serial entrepreneur, a futurist, and the managing executive at Serial Consulting, a leading small business strategy and technology consulting firm. I'm also the author of the book Gorillapreneur, Small Business Strategy for Davids Wanting to Defeat Goliaths, which is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iTunes. This podcast is brought to you by Serial Consulting. An idea can launch a business, a strategy can take it global. Guys, please support the show. How can you do that? You can like the show. You can subscribe to the show. You can leave a comment for the show. You can share the love and share the show with your friends. Do it in iTunes, do it in the Apple Podcast app, or do it in Podomatic. Do it at Spreaker. Go to Sierra.com/podcast and do it there. But just do it. In today's show, we have an exciting interview for you with Dr. Mohammad Rahman, Associate Professor of Management at Purdue University's Krannert School of Management. Dr. Rahman is an expert in various topics relating to big data, digital retailing, sharing economy, and consumer behavior and decision making. Dr. Rahman's research delves into measuring and quantifying the impact of the internet and related innovations on various industries and markets, how the local market structure plays a role in digital transformation, the economic value of digital footprints driving consumer behaviors and improving decision-making, and the impact of information technology on a firm's business and operational practices. Dr. Rahman published a white paper entitled Shared Prosperity, or lack thereof, in the sharing economy, which examines the spillover effects of Airbnb on the growth of complementary local services like bars and restaurants. In this interview, he and I delve into that white paper and try to determine if those spillover effects are the same in all communities regardless of demographics. Here is my interview with Dr. Mohammad Rahman of Purdue University's Krannert School of Management. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Mohammad Rahman of the Krannert School of Management at Purdue University. Dr. Rahman, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I got really excited when I came across your paper, Shared Prosperity or Lack Thereof, in the sharing economy, where you examine the spillover effects of Airbnb on the growth of complementary local services like restaurants and bars. You conclude that Airbnb does indeed have a spillover effect in all communities except for those that are predominantly minority, African Americans and Latinos. Could you please help us by explaining the methodology, the difference methodology that you use to measure the impact Airbnb had on these local services?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me on the podcast. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about it. Now, in terms of the difference methodology, the way it works is that, first of all, we think about finding locations, so in this case, neighborhoods that did not have any Airbnb, right? So, before 2012 or 2011, practically no areas in New York had Airbnb. And in fact, like earlier than that, no areas had Airbnb anywhere in the country because that wasn't even founded. So we first, we take a look at these different locations before Airbnb was founded. And then we take a look at a location, let's say location A, and if that has significant Airbnb activity, then we see what's going on because of Airbnb in location A after Airbnb activity is being significant. Now, that needs to be compared with another location, so let's call that B, where A and B were practically similar in all aspects, in terms of demographics, in terms of income, in terms of the business establishments, and so on and so forth, before the Airbnb activity. The only difference is now, and the only difference between A and B today is, well, A got Airbnb activity, significant Airbnb activity, but B does not. So that allows us to compare across time for location A and across also locations with B, and then and find the difference, and then make conclusions in terms of if Airbnb is causing a spillover in employment for restaurants. Hopefully that's clear now, and that makes sense.
It absolutely does. So essentially you are trying to find a good test environment where Airbnb did not exist and compare that to see if there are measurable differences when Airbnb is introduced to those local services.
Absolutely. That's it.
In your study, you looked at the role of demographics and market concentration in creating some of these variances. What did you find?
So I think, first of all, you already talked about the average effect, but I guess let's just, clarify the magnitude of that, right? So what we find is, on an average, when Airbnb activity goes up by 2% in a local neighborhood, then the employment shift, so there is an increase in employment for restaurant employment of 3% in that particular neighborhood. Now, that is an average effect across New York, and in fact, that average kind of holds up across 5 other big cities we studied. Now, of course, these neighborhoods are made of different demographics, so we can then think about, looking at more nuances. And to look at more nuances, what we do is we find neighborhoods that are predominantly, in our case, we're defining predominant being 50% or more of a certain race or origin. So if 50% of more is of white race in a neighborhood, then we're considering that to be predominantly white. And if it is the case that the 50% or more is black, then it is a black neighborhood. Or if the origin is Hispanic, 50% or more, that is a Hispanic neighborhood. Now, there could be overlaps. There could be 50% or more Hispanic and 50% or more black, and in that case, that neighborhood falls in both of those buckets. Now, once we do this, then we can again do our analysis in this smaller subsample, if you will, right? So now we're doing the experiment on samples where if they're predominantly white or if they're predominantly black or Hispanic. Now, what we find is that, interestingly, the employment effect is holding fine in predominantly white neighborhoods. In fact, I think the magnitude is even slightly larger. So it goes up from 2% increase in Airbnb activity leads to about 4% actually of employment growth in predominantly white neighborhoods. But when we think about the minority neighborhoods, black and Hispanic neighborhoods, we do not find any significance of the employment growth. So we don't find any kind of evidence that suggests that employment is significantly going up with Airbnb activity. So in other words, there is Airbnb activity in these neighborhoods, so in these black neighborhoods or these Hispanic neighborhoods, but there is not enough restaurant activity such that employment is going up. So that's kind of what's surprising to us.
That is surprising. And in your paper, you looked at a number of factors that may have contributed to that correlation not being as consistent in those communities. And I was, quite frankly, it really got me thinking. In white communities, the correlation was clear. Increase in Airbnb led to an even greater increase in employment. But in minority communities, the correlation was not so clear. I wondered if we could isolate the factors that limited that correlation from having the same effect in minority communities.
Yeah, so, generally when you do an empirical study like this, you always have to make sure that you think about the alternative processes, alternative explanations that can be there, right? So this is where we try to control for pretty much all the alternatives we could think of and then see if this is still the case. So it's important to realize, I think a lot of people just quickly react and think of, well, it may be that, people are not even staying in this black neighborhood, so why would we see employment impact? That's not the case. The methodology is making sure people are staying in black neighborhoods. But, so despite them staying there, we are not seeing the employment.
Now, in your paper, you dive deeply into the correlation between the Airbnb reviews and Yelp reviews. Can you help the audience understand why the Yelp reviews are so important in creating that correlation, or if it does have an effect on that correlation?
So, that's a good question, actually. So, essentially from an economic measurement perspective, employment numbers are fine because that's actually the better measure. That's the government-provided measures of people working in these different restaurants. So why do we need to worry about Yelp? Well, it's because we are saying that, look, because of Airbnb bringing in visitors in a neighborhood, these visitors are going to the local restaurants, and that's driving the employment. So we are saying that is the mechanism. So Yelp reviews allow us to actually provide evidence to that mechanism. So when we're claiming a causation here that Airbnb is causing, the spillover of Airbnb is causing employment growth, and in the process involves these visitors going to the restaurants locally. Now, how do we verify that? Well, that's where Yelp becomes very handy. As we know, people review restaurants on Yelp. Now, what we have been able to do is we actually collected all the reviews that ever was written for any restaurant, whether they're open or closed, for all restaurants in New York. So it's about 35,000 restaurants in New York that was ever in business or still in business. And then all the reviews written for this set of restaurants by any reviewer in the whole time, between 2005 and about 2015. That's when we stopped. We don't have employment data after that. Now, when you do that, you can look at the lifetime activity of a review. And then we actually, so then what we did is we looked at, for any reviewer who wrote a review for a New York restaurant, their lifetime reviewing activity. So whatever restaurants they have written a review for, we collected that. Now, once we do that, we know we can credibly figure out if you are from New York or not. Because, if somebody is writing reviews and more than 75% of their reviews are coming from New York, we consider that person to be a New Yorker, along with the fact that, they declare that they're from New York. But, we know a lot of people, they put their location as, like other states or other cities, but they still live in New York. So this is where it's important to see their review activity in their whole lifetime. Now, the more important part is the visitors. So when we look at visitors, we say, okay, first of all, you have to say you are not from New York. That's the first kind of check mark. But that's not enough because, you could be saying you're from California, but you live in New York. So that's why we use your lifetime reviewing activity and make sure that, okay, majority of your reviewing activity happen outside New York. So you're not reviewing just New York. If you're reviewing all the New York restaurants, majority of the times, like 75% or more, and we use different cutoffs, then we don't use that as a visitor. Now, once we know that, now we can figure out if the number of visitors are going up in a restaurant or in the restaurants in the neighborhood, and is that going up because of Airbnb activity? So that's where we use the Yelp reviews, and we do see that. So when Airbnb activity goes up, so when Airbnb brings visitors to local neighborhoods, people do indeed go and visit the restaurant, frequent them, and spend money there. And that then makes sense that we're seeing the employment impact. So this is why, so I think in some ways Yelp allows us to close the loop, or, it provides an important part of the puzzle to make sure that we indeed see people coming to visit, stay in a local neighborhood, they go to their local restaurants, they eat there, and then because of people's increased demand for food in those local restaurants, we see an employment growth.
When I read through that part of the paper, I had two things that came to mind. The first question that came to mind was how much of the Yelp review history drove the decision-making of the Airbnb guest. So if you had an existing history, would that give you a greater likelihood of eating in the neighborhood versus no history and that person making a choice to go where the Yelp reviews directed them to, which may be outside of the neighborhood?
Absolutely, right? I mean, we know that people, especially when you travel, people rely on our similar services, maybe Google ratings nowadays, but Yelp is still the dominant provider in this case. So absolutely. And this is critical. This is where we actually created what's called a popularity index of the restaurants in the neighborhood. And we actually make sure the popularity is time variant and dynamic. So the popularity could be changing every month. So we create an index and make sure that we understand the popularity of restaurants in a neighborhood relative to the other neighborhoods in New York. So that allows us to make sure that, okay, we're not getting because you're right, the employment growth could happen even so, like there could be an Airbnb guest or not, but employment growth could happen in a neighborhood where people are just coming because of very popular restaurants. And yes, there may be more Airbnb people staying in those areas, but even if they don't eat out, it's other people coming and eating in those neighborhoods, but then we'll be making a wrong causal link. So that's why we have to make sure that we control for the popularity of these places, and we do. And naturally, popularity has a huge impact on the demand, but once we control for that, we still see that Airbnb has an impact.
So that popularity index, that's that concentration analysis that you had in the paper that essentially took those most popular restaurants and removed them from the study so that you got a cleaner look at the causation between Airbnb and local services?
Not really. So the stuff we removed is the popular tourist destinations. So we don't include those neighborhoods in the analysis, because popular tourist destinations. So we use Yelp reviews. You're right. We use Yelp reviews to identify and verify that certain neighborhoods like Manhattan and others, right? So they're very sort of popular. So Upper East Side, Lower East Side. These are very popular areas, regardless of Airbnb activity. So we remove those areas. That's one stage. That's clear. That's important because that's even it's not useful to analyze those areas because they get a lot of visitors regardless, and they of course have a lot of Airbnb. So you'll be making wrong conclusions if you look at those. But the part where if you look at the paper, there is something called local restaurant popularity that we derive. So that is derived for the neighborhoods that are retained. So these are non-popular neighborhoods. So these are not really traditional visitor-centric neighborhoods. These are typically residential neighborhoods. But even there are lots of restaurants. So we make sure that we control for the popularity of the restaurants in a neighborhood to make, for the reasons I described before. We don't want people to be coming to these neighborhoods just to eat in those neighborhoods because of their great restaurants, and then ignoring that for their contribution in the employment growth, right? So once we do the popularity index, we account for the contribution of great popularity of the restaurants in the employment growth.
Got you. The second question I had about that Yelp data is I wondered if there was a equal amount of Yelp reviews across the different communities, white, black, Hispanic, when looking at those local restaurants that you examined. Just looking at anecdotal data of the communities that I've grown up in, a lot of the black businesses didn't have a whole lot of Yelp reviews. People knew them, went there based on word of mouth, but rarely put in a Yelp review. Did you find that in the data?
That's true. So I don't think you're right. I don't think we have sort of homogeneity in terms of Yelp review showing up, right? I think that's what you were sort of getting at. No. So that's the thing. We don't really see that sort of homogeneity. There is a fair amount of discrepancy in terms of the availability of Yelp reviews in neighborhoods. So if such communities are not, so we don't know the reasons for, like such communities not having enough reviews or whatnot. But if that, if a community is not highlighting what's available in their neighborhoods, or, hosts are not proactively sort of suggesting, hey, we have great restaurants, the Yelp may not be showing them, that could be partly driving the not significant employment effect in those minority neighborhoods.
So that could be a strategy for organizations like the NAACP that partnered with Airbnb back in 2016, hoping to get the spillover effects outlined in your paper. To truly achieve those spillover benefits, the NAACP may need to extend their partnership to platforms like Yelp and Google.
Absolutely. I think it's very important to highlight the options you have, right? So, at this moment, we don't know why this is happening, right? There are different alternative explanations, and maybe multiple of them are at play. One is basically it's completely harmless. People are coming and staying in these neighborhoods, and they just don't find options they like, or when they search, they don't see things, right? So they may exist, they're not showing up, or they may not exist. Then that's just an availability issue. So that's sort of the next step we want to find out. If there is a sort of a difference in terms of the diversity that's available, the diversity of cuisine, is there sort of some sort of discrepancy in those things, and is that driving it? Because I can see that there could be always a little bit of racial bias inside people, right? Prejudice, right? So people may not feel safe walking around because of whatever people think of these areas and hear about these areas. But I can't believe that that is the only reason. I don't have evidence to say that is the only reason. So I can definitely see a lot of value in being very proactive. The fact that people have chosen to come to the area, we now got to take advantage of that.
I agree with you. The fact that they made the choice to book in a diverse community indicates a desire to experience the culture of that community. So in my mind, there has to be an information gap surrounding the available local service options.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think, doing a good campaign, proactive campaigns by restaurants, the restaurant owners and the local economic development officers or Airbnb hosts, they're coming together to really highlight these restaurants and making sure, they are getting the prominence and building up their reputation is important.
Now, you looked at a couple of communities that were exceptions. One that proved out, I think, your spillover effect, and then one that was a complete outlier in terms of minority community and the link between Airbnb and employment. Los Angeles was one of those. What did you see there?
Well, so what we see is actually, that's an interesting point. So for Los Angeles, we do see Airbnb spillover impact on the employment growth. But then I guess it's also important to note that Los Angeles got about 50% or more of the population identified themselves as Latinos. So realistically, if you feel like you would find any fact that they are a dominant group there, so it's not surprising that shows up there as an average, right? And even if there are prejudices or, racism or whatever you have in people's mind about certain population, you can't go to Los Angeles and say, okay, I don't want to see Hispanic people or I don't want to go to restaurants where they're hanging out. That's just not going to work. So it's not surprising that is holding there.
Mm. And then you also looked at New Orleans, which I found fascinating. I spent a number of years in New Orleans, and there are terrific restaurants all throughout the city. And I think you found some of the most unique causal data between adjacent communities in New Orleans.
Absolutely. And I think New Orleans was really a great find for us because, sort of a dream for researchers is to be able to randomly change some policy so we can really establish causal links for, applied economists like me, where we care about causal links to understand what's causing the impact rather than, so basically going more than the correlation because, correlation is, of course, useful, but it doesn't really necessarily tell you what's causing it, so you can't make policy choices or change things. But New Orleans, so we got lucky in the sense that they had a policy shift. So New Orleans, like many other cities, got Airbnb activities and technically was illegal up until late 2016. But, that didn't stop Airbnb activity, just like it didn't stop in any other place in the world. So, but I guess in late 2016, the city came together, even with Airbnb and others, to say, okay, we got to come up with the policy and sort of make sure, this is now working and it's legalized. So they come up with the whole registration policy. Now I think you're required to register to do Airbnb activity in New Orleans, which is great. But then the city said, well, we're going to ban Airbnb from one particular area of the city. So this is where, this is where I think the policy part comes into play for us. That's a random shot to this area because, it turns out that this area had a huge amount of Airbnb activity. So French Quarter District, right, is a popular district for all sort of tourist activity in New Orleans. But then French Quarter had a lot of Airbnb listings already. Now, what happened is that the city said, we're going to ban Airbnb there. Now, what happened? Well, naturally, the adjacent district, Central Business District, it was fine. It was fine. It was legal to do Airbnb activity post-2016, so starting from 2017. So because of this natural policy shift, what we see is a huge dip in Airbnb listings, Airbnb activity in French Quarter, starting from the first quarter of 2017, and a steady rise in Airbnb activity for the Central Business District. So basically demand shift. Now, that's a great thing for a researcher like me, because now what we're able to do is, we can see, okay, what happened to the restaurant activity? So since we don't have employment data beyond 2015 from the government yet, and 2017 will come out in a few years. So we looked at Yelp reviews, which are pretty good indicators of restaurant activity anyways. So what we see is, after this shift, Central Business District saw the record amount of Yelp review activity by visitors, but French Quarter District saw a record dip. So when we plotted it, so that we could see the seasonal trends, because seasonal trends are important. A lot of times, seasons would dictate the amount of visitors. But even when you think about it, account for the seasonal trends, when you look at the plots, French Quarter District had the lowest amount of visitor activity in its history since Airbnb activity, since 2013, whereas Central Business District got the biggest bump in its sort of recent time. So that gives you very clear evidence that Airbnb is causing the restaurant activity shift by visitors. Visitors are coming to restaurants that are brought by Airbnb.
Wow. That is the clearest, link in terms of driving local growth that I think, you could see local restaurants you would think would line up behind an Airbnb effort to make sure that it is accepted in their communities when they see that sort of link, particularly what happened in New Orleans.
Absolutely. And I mean, there is anecdotal evidence of that, right? So, I mean, when Santa Monica was going through the whole Airbnb discussion, I think a lot of small businesses showed up, like cleaners that sort of were, was basically doing a business, or some of the home cleaners, they start businesses basically based on Airbnb activity, so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think there is some of that. And, I think in some of these policy discussions, I suspect a lot of the local businesses come together, but, there are other factors that play a role in these policy discussions.
Dr. Rahman, we absolutely appreciate you taking the time to explain your paper and get into some of the nuances of what may help communities benefit from Airbnb. Before we let you go, do you have any closing thoughts on the sharing economy and shared prosperity? And are we on the right track with embracing these sorts of changes in the economy?
I think this is an interesting question. I think, digital transformation is going to happen. We ought to see more and more transformation. Now, whether or not we're on the right track, I think it depends on the viewpoint you take. But my sort of take on this is a lot of times we make assumptions that the digital transformation, in this case the sharing economy, is sort of equally homogeneously affecting everybody. I think that's what has been sort of my passion in terms of generating insights and research. I have been able to show times and time again that assumption is not valid. So we need to rethink about that assumption. Where we live, how our local factors are quite important in terms of our interactions and benefits we derive, or even the negative impacts we get from a platform or from the digital transformation. So it's difficult to ignore the local factors in this case. It's clear that the sharing economy platform is doing some economic spillover effect, positive effects, but it's not showing up in all areas. Now, so the first step to come up with the remedy is to recognize that it is not showing up everywhere. And hopefully, once that's done, then we can think about local specific factors that are idiosyncratic to the locality to come up with some of the solutions. Because, we still live in the real world. We cannot ignore our environmental real-world factors. And I think that is something I want to leave with your listeners, so that, whenever we think about any sort of digital transformation, any platform, it's important to think about what's around us.
Right. Absolutely. That is very, very critical. Again, sir, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been illuminating for all of us on the podcast who follow and love the sharing economy. You have given us a tremendous amount to think about, and we absolutely appreciate it. For those of you on the podcast, we're going to post a link to Dr. Rahman's paper so that you can delve into this data and take a good look at everything that he has talked about here on the podcast. There's some extremely interesting information on Airbnb and those spillover effects, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. Dr. Rahman, thank you again, and we absolutely appreciate having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Mark. It was a pleasure. I'm really happy to have this opportunity, and honored to have this opportunity.
Gorillapreneurs, thank you for listening to the podcast. Support the show by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing the show. I also want to thank Dr. Rahman for being on the show. Dr. Rahman's research is the bedrock for a coherent strategy that can help diverse communities benefit from the sharing economy. NAACP, you can expect a proposal from Sierra Consulting outlining how we can help improve your partnership with Airbnb. Guys, please check out the show notes and get more information on Dr. Rahman and his white paper, Sharing Prosperity or Lack Thereof in the Sharing Economy. Gorillapreneurs, Scott Sullivan said it best in episode 7. Be a mace, sharpen those spikes, and remember, if you're not breaking something, your company might be the next thing that gets broken.
Thank you for listening to the Gorillapreneur, the Art of Waging Small Business Warfare podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, you may also enjoy the book Gorillapreneur, Small Business Strategy for Davids Wanting to Defeat Goliaths. Available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and iTunes. Follow Mark Peterson on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Gorillapreneur. Now I want to close with a quote from the great Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first, then seek to win. Keep fighting, Gorillapreneurs.